Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. And welcome to this Skill Up session brought to you by PeopleCert. My name is Cody. Welcome back to another exciting learning experience. We do have a round table lined up. Before we get things started, I do have a couple of housekeeping notes I'd like to run through with you. First of all, our session today is being recorded. So if you miss any of our discussion today, perhaps you'd like to rewatch at a later time or, of course, share with your team, you will be receiving an email with a link to access the on-demand recording shortly we conclude our live session today. Now, if you'd like to engage with us, there are a couple of options for you to do so. The first option is the chat tab. So if you see that chat tab on the right side of your screen, I'd like you to go ahead and click it. Let us know from where in the world you are joining us. If you have any specific questions, we do want you to send those into the Q&A tab. Sending in your questions to the Q&A just helps track, and we want to help answer all the questions that we received today. So be sure to send those in. Additionally, if you click the handouts tab, you'll see there is a link there for our prints for next week. So feel free to click that and register early. And of course, at the end of today's program, I will push out a link for a post-webinar survey. So keep an eye out for that. I'd love to hear your feedback. Our conversation today is on how project management drives digital transformation. And I'm joined today by David Tomlinson, Senior Learning Specialist at QA Limited, as our Chief Content Officer here at Techstrong Group. So thank you, David, for joining us today. Mike, do you want to go ahead and get this conversation rolling?
I sure do, but I'm going to call David Tomo from here because otherwise he might not answer me. Tomo, good to see you.
Thanks, Mike. It's an old nickname. I'll answer to just about everything. I'm only normally David, though, when I'm in trouble and my wife's using it. But
I have the same. I'm Michael when my mother's mad at me and Michael Patrick when she's not speaking to me, right? All right. Let's jump into this for a second, though. We have been talking about project management and issues that affect projects and the reasons they go south forever and a day. And now we've been kind of working this through with digital transformation initiatives. And I would argue for every one of these things that we tout as a success, there's probably 19 or more that went south and, got swept under the rug and everybody kind of forgot about it. And I guess the question I would throw at you to start is, what makes project management different in these digital transformation initiatives? What is it that kind of trips us up a lot? And it just seems like something feels different, or is it just that there's more eyes on these projects because they're higher value and there's more people in the company concerned?
Well, I think, first of all, one of the problems with all projects is defining what it is you're trying to do. And if you if you fail to set out your stall, you're probably not going to achieve it anyway. And one of the problems with digital transformation is I say digital transformation, you say potato, I say potato. Everybody has a different interpretation of digital transformation. So I think one of the reasons why they're seen to fail is often because we find it so hard to define success because they're so badly understood. So there's an education piece that, which we would part of startup initiation in Prince 2 terms, but there's that education piece that sometimes has to go along with that, so as to enable us to actively understand what it is we're trying to do. There's also, I think you're right, we've had those why do projects fail studies forever and a day, but communication was always up there, was always in the top 5. I actually like the work of people like Patrick Mayfield, and what he did is he went and he did the stakeholder engagement chapter in MSP, another old Axelos product that's been revamped recently. But he looked at why do things succeed rather than looking at why do things fail. And he personality typed the ideal project and program manager. And what he found was ambiverts, people who were capable of communicating, did better than people who couldn't or didn't. He thought he was looking for a control freak gene, but actually what he ended up with was finding out it's the talkative gene that wins. So it's about perception. Those people who communicate well are always perceived to have succeeded. And with digital transformation being such an emergent new thing anyway, I think that communication is doubled down on. I think absolutely those of us who communicate well will be seen as being successful. half the problem is defining success was not done properly or understood properly as we went through. And therefore, we sort of are inevitably failing because we can never succeed, because we've hobbled the entire thing. So it's also, I think, sometimes we seem to think that it's special. Of course, every project is special. Every project is unique. But of course, there are some age-old techniques and some age-old practices which actually apply just as much to digital as they do to anything else. But we sometimes forget to do them because we're being special. And so I think part of the problem is it's a bit like Wellington said, most people were defeated by Napoleon just by looking at his hat. I think one of the problems is that just putting the words digital transformation in front of a project has already hampered us before we've even started. So communication is the key, and clarity on what it is you're trying to achieve, because ultimately digital transformation for digital transformation's sake does nobody any good. It doesn't pay anybody's paycheck. It doesn't grow the business. It doesn't actually get us anywhere. And I think sometimes, Mike, that's what we've done. We've set ourselves up to do digital transformation because that's what sounds cool. And but I realise it's not even cool anymore, Mike, to say cool anymore. But, we've done it because we've jumped on the bandwagon without actually knowing where that bandwagon is due to take us. So a deep and full understanding of what are the benefits we're trying to get from our digital transformation and where is it going, we will then set ourselves up to be successful. We might change 30 times how we do it because digital will emerge as we go. But as long as we have that North Star, I think we've got an outside chance of winning. Without that guiding star, without a GPS, I think we're going to be lost in the desert no matter what we try and do. And no matter how fantastic the elements are that we use. I sometimes refer to this as the idiot lantern. It illuminates very little, but we stare into it a lot. We need to think the other way around and say, well, what is our digital transformation trying to achieve? And then we can set ourselves objectives that make sense.
Do you think we're reaching a point where maybe we aren't rushing in as much as we used to, right? When the buzzword first came out, everybody was like, ooh, let's go do something today without that North Star and plan. So are we getting a little bit smarter and a little more mature and realizing, we need to build something that scales? I think there's an African proverb that goes something like, if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together. Is this a go together moment?
I think you're right. I think that's true. I mean, I always tell my students that if you ever fall asleep in a meeting and somebody comes to you and says, what do you think, Mike? Say, how does that scale? It doesn't matter if you've just woken up. No one would have thought of it. And it makes you always sound wise. But I think there is this idea of so much of the things that lie behind digital transformation is small scale. Scrum is a lovely framework, but it's a team-based framework. It's not a full project. And people go, I can't manage my projects with Scrum. And you go, well, there's a reason for that. You're not supposed to. There's a very good reason for it. A 16-page guide isn't going to get you there. But essentially, we can do it in the microcosm, but we find it so hard to do it in the round. We find it so hard to do it at scale. And I think there's almost, I think we're getting better, Mike, at suspending our disbelief. I think we're getting slightly better at, playing along, as it were, with the digital agenda. Because the more we talk about it, people often say to me, don't people get bored listening to the project manager banging on about the benefits of their project? No. Fundamentally, if they're not playing the trumpet for their project, then who the hell is? Fundamentally, and you have to say things 6 times before people get it. And I think we're getting to that point with a lot of people, Mike. I think you're right. There are more digitally native people around, and I think the message is being, properly understood. But as much as I think we should communicate the message, I did say this idea, if you're getting technical advice from your project manager, you hired the wrong techies. There is this point that someone's still going to manage the project, and that lies to the project manager. And as much as we might fall in love with it, fundamentally, our job is to conduct the orchestra, not play the instruments. And, you can do both jobs, but, somebody's got to fly the plane. Somebody's got to make this thing work. Somebody's got to get us to our destination. Otherwise, when we do land, we'll find we're in the wrong airport and we don't have the right stairs to fit the aircraft because somebody hasn't thought that through. So yeah, it is one of those things where, first and foremost, somebody, a project manager, that's why it's a project, has to have that in mind. I love continuous improvement, and I love, working in service management. It's my other string to my bow, but that's business as usual, and that works for that. But a project's got to have an end, and it's got to have a destination. Otherwise, it's not really a project. And I think sometimes, that gets missed. The business case being, central. I think that's one of the strengths of Prince, is it's always put the business case central into what we do, because fundamentally, if it's not giving us any benefit, then the project should close and we should all give up and walk away, and come back some other time. And that's not failure. That's actually digital transformational projects that stop and then restart in a different guise, I don't think are necessarily failures. It just proves that we didn't understand it the first time round. and it's better to stop it early before we've spent all those millions of dollars or hundreds of thousands of pounds or whatever. Better to stop it early and give that money back to use, to use again in a different direction than it is to let it carry in too much. And this is one of the things that Prince 2 Agile brought in, this idea of, having 2 iterations and saying that's good enough and walking away is not project failure. It's actually a project win. It's to say we've done enough and need no more. So I think we're becoming more intelligent about how we view these transformational journeys, and we understand them a little bit better into, at which point does it cease to be a project, and at which point does it actually just become the way we do things around here. Going back to good old John P. Cotter's 8 steps to transformational change, an oldie but a goodie. But actually, he's got a point where there comes a point when, the project is finished, but our digital transformation has to mean something somewhere. So understanding that, I think, is the key.
To your point, too, I mean, it's a bad metaphor, and no offense to our friends in Chicago who might be on this, but if I set out on a journey to Chicago in the middle of winter and I ultimately wind up in Hawaii, it's not a bad thing, right?
And it's or speaking of Englishmen, vice versa. Because you've got to remember that the only thing that makes our summer is the rain gets a bit warmer. But understanding is the fact that it's okay to be somewhere else if you're getting the benefits that you're looking for. There's more than one way of doing it. And I think one of the problems we sometimes have, we have this sort of cookie cutter idea that we can just take, oh yeah, they're Amazon, they do well. Let's take what they did. And oh yeah, great, we saw this corporation, let's do what they did. But of course it worked for them because they're them. It's not necessarily going to work for us. And it's okay to set out with those ambitions, but work out a slightly different way of doing it that means something to us. People say to me, of all those Prince 2 principles, which one's the best? And I think tailoring. Without a doubt, it's got to be a project that works for us, and it's got to be a product that comes out of it that works for us. And that means being self-aware. And I think that you're right, Mike. This idea of do we understand digital transformation, because it is so all-encompassing, it's really how self-aware is the business. How well do we understand ourselves? And I worked once in a family business, and in a family business, so much goes unsaid. And are we really aware of where we really are? And the answer is probably not. And I think that sort of self-reflection that sometimes is needed, which is why it is so vitally important that we don't just leap in, we do that startup. We get our ducks in a row, as we say, and we get something that gives you, that's detailed enough to have something to hang off, but not so restrictive that we can't truly innovate. And that's the real trick, Mike. Any fool can make it complicated. The hard part is getting that mix of simplicity and be comfortable with generating that decomposition as we go, because that takes real confidence.
How does a project manager have that conversation? I mean, you talked about Prince 2 a couple of times. It's a great methodology for managing projects at scale. It clearly has some parts to it that, help you not fall off the highway. They're essentially guardrails. But I think when project managers try to have that conversation with the rest of the business, they don't get it. They don't understand that terminology or methodology. So how do you have that conversation where you can bring people who are not Prince 2 specialists or students and get them to understand the workflow that we're trying to put in place for success.
Yeah, I think there are some things which have made it from our world into their world, right? So, ITIL invented the term SLA 30 odd years ago. Everybody knows what a service level agreement is now. There are some things that have migrated, and there's some project terminology that people get. I think it's also true that, we learnt the glossary for the exam, but we shouldn't think that, the same with all certificated methodologies. We learn the ceremony, but we've got to recognise that it's not our job to educate the rest of the world into that. I worked with the military for 26 years. They have a language all of their own, some of it quite clipped, some of it quite succinct, and you have to express it in their terminology. You cannot do a digital transformation like I did within the Ministry of Defence and start talking to people in what they used to call wiggly amps talk. There's no point doing that. It's not going to make any sense to them. You've got to learn to express in a way that makes sense to them. But at the same time, you've got to use the right language with your suppliers and with some of your providers, because they will have that precise meaning in their heads. I think having a dictionary of your own, you don't necessarily have to publish it, but I think being consistent in your language is important. But it's part of this tailoring idea of, we sometimes you'd have people say, we're following, PMBOK, for example, and so the processes all look like this, and you just go off into PMBOK speak, and everybody just stands back and goes, what happened here? I have no idea what you're talking about. You have to make it in a way that makes sense for them. And if that means that, we have to learn a different, the business language. Well, when we look at, we do, there's linked down with PeopleCert and DevOps Institute. One of the things they did in their skill survey is they said, as a good techie, what do you need to know? And actually, if you added together business skills responses and soft skills responses, they actually outnumber technical skills responses. Mm-hmm. So the great bizarre thing is, all the people who get hired as a techie think they got hired for being a techie. Yet you ask the people who hired them, and they hired them because they showed they understood the business and they clearly have the necessary soft skills. They worry about the technical skills afterwards. So the reality is the people doing the hiring, the people looking and searching, are looking for people with business skills, looking for people with people skills, looking for people who can translate that technical world into plain speaking, or as close as we can get it. Far more than they're worrying about, how technically competent are they, because they can always hire that in, or we can train for it. That's not really a problem. And anyway, as you well know, Mike, in this digital world, nailing your technical skills to the mast is like jelly to the wall. It's constantly going to change. You're constantly following that thing, but your ability to translate this into the language of the business, that's a pearl. And if you want to say how to differentiate great project managers from good ones, and that's it. It's that ability to communicate. We don't have to be a Ronald Reagan, by the way, but the great communicator. But I think that ability to explain complex things in a simple way, and risking sometimes it turning out slightly differently and you're looking a bit foolish, which is why I always say that humility, Mike, is one of the key qualities we're looking for in that. I think that's key.
I think turning things into easily understood language is a critical skill that a lot of folks seem to lack, especially in the technical world. There's a question from one of our audience attendees kind of pointing at this a little bit, but he's suggesting that the project managers really need to know the product and the environment where the implementation is going to occur. And I think there's a tendency for some project managers to say, I'm a project manager, I can manage any project, but do they really need to kind of get a little deeper into the business and understand how this thing operates and where its weaknesses are?
Yeah, I think we're really a pond skater. We're really sitting between, the film of the water and the air, and we're constantly in that situation where on the one side we have our, the deep technical knowledge of the people we're working with who understand their business, what they do very well, and the wider business that this thing has got to land in. And you can have, I think one of the things that came out of this study that Patrick Mayfield did is that you're 4 times more likely to be thought of as successful if it was communicated well than the actual quality of the product. So what he said was, look, a mediocre product, well handled and communicated, is thought of better than a brilliant product, badly handled. So actually, whilst we do look at the quality of the product, and we're having talks about this this month and every month, as you always do, but fundamentally, your inability to communicate the quality of that product, or the ability to communicate back into us what we need to put into that quality, is going to be key to making that work. So I have in my time been a good soldier. I've also been a perfectly good banker. I've also been a perfectly good care assistant. I've also been, I've been a little bit of every project I've ever done, because I left a bit of me behind, but I took a bit away. And as a project manager, you think you're impervious and you're some kind of enzyme that doesn't get used up. You don't. You contaminate the project contaminates you, for good or ill. And understanding that culture, and I think that's the word that we often don't use, and it's cultural. You need to have that cultural understanding of the environment you're in, so that you give it meaning and context. For example, I work with the military, and a lot of things didn't get written down, and people go, why didn't it get written down? And you go, but these are officers. Your word is your bond. Nobody expects you to write it down. That's the culture. The culture is, if I look you in the eye, Mike, and say, I'm doing it for you, I'm doing it. And that's the end of it. And we will move heaven and earth to make that happen, because that is just not the way the military works. It is, my word is my bond. If I say you're getting it, you're getting it. And that's it. And we need to understand that culture to work within it. Whereas, of course, with politicians, we all know politicians make promises, but they're not always what you might call my word is my bond type promises. They live in a much more, shall we say, morally flexible world, where, of course, it's the art of the possible. So if you're working, as I have, in government at the higher reaches, you've got to understand that you're living in a different context. What we have is a clash of culture. And project managers have to have that cultural antenna, I think. And it's much harder when it's the other side of the world and it's in 4 different languages. It's much more difficult. But many digital transformations are being done by large multinational corporations with exactly that cultural problem to be solved. The actual technical problems, if I'm being true, all these things I've done don't amount to more than 10 or 15% of the work I've ever done as a project manager. 50-60% is about people, and the rest is about process. And by far the majority is people.
To that end, I think over time what happens is people start to resent the project manager, because the project manager is always coming to them and saying, what's up with this? Where's that? And the data collection process gets people kind of agitated. Is there some way to collect that information about the status of the project without having necessarily, call people up and interview them and get them to fill out a form? Is there some more intelligent way to kind of aggregate that data in a way that, has the project manager showing up and saying, hey, it looks like we're going to fall off the cliff in 3 weeks because of the data suggests this, and have more of an informed data-driven conversation versus a conversation where they come across as kind of like, the local school crossing guard, making sure everybody stays in the lines.
Yeah, you do get this problem where we have a reputation of being like, the deputy headmistress preparing a report for the headmaster sort of thing. There's that principle. Mm-hmm. There's that kind of thing. I think there are 2 things here. One is the fact that how the heck can we do a digital transformation project if we don't do it digitally? There's a fundamental eat your own dog food, as we say. There's a fundamental, if we're going to champion working in the digital way, then so should we. And the second thing is, most data already exists. When you ask for it from people, they're not synthesizing it, they're just rehashing it. You can build data models which will quite happily harvest that automatically for you. And automation, which is, always comes up in these discussions, but automation of the toil of project management, that repetitive, pointless stuff that we do. Absolutely. And this is where, a good PMO, a good project management office or program management office serving several projects, they can have that tooling, they can have that kind of thing that allows that to happen, and they can bring that to the party. I don't recommend one tool over another. That's not my job. I'm not a sales rep. But fundamentally, the tooling is out there to build the data queries that we need to be able to extract that data automatically. What I look for when I do bring people up and interview them is their opinion. And who doesn't want to be rung up to be asked your opinion? You know, everybody would like to have their opinion consulted. You know, RACI, was it, you know, responsible, accountable, consulted, or informed? We all fancy being consulted because it doesn't mean you do the work, but it still means people listen to you. An actual fact, then, that allows it to be a true conversation rather than. So I can share my intent. What am I, as a project manager, intending to do it? And then ask them to go away and figure it out and then come back with their intent. And if their intent matches my intent, we're off to the races. And now they're working on something they thought of rather than what I thought of. Even though, Mike, as we both know, I probably worked out how it was going to be done anyway. But that's not the point. The point is what you now have is an autonomous, motivated individual that's on the case, not somebody who thinks that you're treating them like an automata. And the very best leaders, and project managers are leaders. I think, you know, project management is missing the point. You've got to be a leader to do it. But the very best leaders know how to do this. The very best leaders make you the most important person in the room when they talk to you.
I think there's an opportunity for project managers to change the way that they engage with folks as well. Every project that I've ever seen is an exercise in robbing Peter to pay Paul to make something happen. But if I'm in charge of one specific aspect of this thing and I'm running into bottlenecks, theoretically, the project manager should be able to make a case for me to have additional resources because they know what the dependencies are and what the impact of that down the line is. So I think a lot of times, you know, rather than coming across as the head mistress putting the report together, the project manager can present themselves as kind of the one who provides the data that supports the case for additional resources every time we encounter these dependencies or something is slowed down. I don't think it's a question of blame. I think it's more a question of, you know, help me make the case to rob Peter for an extra couple hours rather than Paul.
Yeah, and I think, you know, we often used to use, I think it was Rudyard Kipling's poem, If, used to be the sort of project manager's sort of go-to piece of inspiration. But actually, I quite like Simon and Garfunkel, Bridge Over Troubled Waters. I'm on your side, Mike. Actually, that's a real message. For those guys who haven't discovered it, go and watch it. Go and listen to the back catalogue. You'll get a tea in your eye if you really listen to the words. But fundamentally, that's what we want in life, isn't it? We want allies. We want to think we master what we do. We want to think that people are there to help us. And it's that supportive leadership. It's that transformational supportive leadership, which I think project managers can do. One of the best project managers I worked with when I was, running technical teams is he'd never chide me for being late. He'd go, Tomo, now I know it's well in hand and I'm sure it's completely finished, but just a reminder, this is needed by Thursday. But he always preceded it with, I'm very confident in you. Of course, I went away going, damn, what am I going to do? I went away going, do you know what? I never let the guy down. Now, he's no longer with us anymore, but I went to his funeral and I had to stand outside on loudspeakers because there wasn't room in the church.
Wow.
And if that's how you're judged, then yeah, Mike had that. Another Mike, but Mike had that in spades. But he never, ever belittled anybody. Yeah. And he treated people from the most junior to the most senior with the utmost of respect. And he was an army officer, but he spoke to generals and private soldiers exactly the same. You know, he treated everybody like a human being. And we probably worked longer and harder for him than any other project man I've ever worked with in my career. I've probably worked longer and harder for him than anybody else. I was, more's the point, Mike, happy to do so, not resentful. So it can be done, but it requires, and he wasn't being cynical about it, this was genuinely the way the guy worked. But it's about understanding that everybody's doing their best job. No one's letting the side down, you know.
At least not on purpose, right?
Absolutely, well, yeah. And anyway, if they do screw up, at least they encourage them to screw up quickly so that we can deal with it when it's cheap. because it's always very expensive to deal with it when it's too late. So this is something we can learn from the world of construction. Even though we're in the digital world, we can learn from the construction people. Changing the windows in a house is very expensive at the end. It's much better to get the dimensions right earlier. So if we are going to make a mistake, let's make a mistake nice and early, where we can take account of it. And I think that is one of the things I talk about. Mike, have you ever been to St. Paul's Cathedral? Well-known, big thing, right? If you go to the nave, there is a wooden model that Sir Christopher Wren used for the cathedral, and you can go and see it. And when you first walk in, you go, "Wow, this is St. Paul's Cathedral." And then you go there, well, hang on, it's not exactly like that. And then you realise that the model he presented to the king to get the money for this thing doesn't actually look anything like the thing that got built. And you realise that all that was a transitional model that says, it literally was a cruciform square church, and it turns out to have a long nave, and it's completely different. And it has a dome, but the dome looks different. And you suddenly realise that actually that's changed out of all proportion. But it was okay to have that working hypothesis, and it was okay for that hypothesis to change, because we go now to St. Paul's Cathedral and go, look what a wonderful building it is, but it wasn't the original idea. And that's sort of okay. So failing, as long as you fail early, it's when you have to tear down the entire cathedral and build it again that you've got a problem. And in digital points of view, we sometimes think that just because it's digital, we can afford to get it wrong late. But actually, what we should be doing, we can, put change in, right at the death, because it is digital. But fundamentally, let's make the mistakes early when they're cheap, when they're easy to deal with. And so therefore, if you've tried something, Mike, and it didn't come off, you know what? Try something else. Because fundamentally, one of them is going to be a winner, and we're going to save a lot more money in the long run and a lot more time and effort in the long run by being willing to experiment as we go. But fundamentally, traditionally in project management, the ethos was, don't screw up. And that doesn't work in the digital world, where you can experiment so cheaply. We can have another way of doing that, and change it again relatively cheaply. So therefore, taking this idea of, it's about experiment and learning, and bringing that into the culture. And people say, well, how is digital transformation different from all the other software projects I've done? Well, it's fundamentally is that, nobody knows how to do digital transformation perfectly. Hasn't really happened, and nobody really knows how to do it. As a result, your perfect is not mine perfect, and nor should it be. And I think it's having that willingness and people feeling psychologically safe enough that you're not going to berate them, that you're not going to come down on them like a ton of bricks. I think that's really, really important. I can use my judgment without being judgmental. It's a fundamental that, judgment is internal. Judgmentalism is toxic. So I can use my judgment, but that doesn't mean I'm going to judge others or be seen to do that. What we need to be is provide that positivity. And that's really why we've always struggled with things. I know one of the participants mentioned benefits. How do we capture benefits? We don't like necessarily having the benefits conversation, because if we have that blame culture going, we don't want to set out our stall for something we're going to get beaten up for later. So there's a natural tendency to go a bit fuzzy on the benefits because we're not quite sure how it's going to work. But actually, the benefits should be set at a high enough level and captured well enough that it then allows things like our acceptance criteria to come out of them, rather than the other way around. It's not build it and then let's work out what to do with it. It's let's work out what we want to get done and then go in that direction. And I think fundamentally, capturing benefits and working with them as we go is key to understanding. PM Bok, I think it was 6 before they mentioned the word benefits to any particular number, because traditionally project managers hadn't really cared about that. It's just been bang, 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 get it out the door. We worry about how it works later. That's the business's problem. But fundamentally, that with digital transformations, you just can't do that. It's too integral with how the business works. We're not just putting up new curtains. We're changing the light bulb. In fact, we're changing the whole house to work on hydrogen. We're changing the paradigm.
Right. So to that point, we have another question about scoping. The business case can be difficult because a lot of this digital transformation stuff is a little on the amorphous side. It is in response to something, whether it was COVID or a downturn in the economy, where people are, I don't want to say that the business is winging it, but they're kind of like just putting this out there and see where it goes. And it's a giant experiment. And do we need to embrace the experiment, or do we need to be really hard about what the business benefits are going to be?
Yeah, I mean, nobody sets out to make the business worse than you set off from. Yeah, I've seen plenty of projects that do. It's not what we set out to do. I think it's understanding that if all you're going to do is make money, by the way, that's not really a benefit. Making money is something that happens as a result of providing someone with a benefit, because there's plenty of other things going to happen too. It's a strategic objective. It's not really a direct benefit. Savings can be, I suppose. But fundamentally, we need to know, if we're going to go and, what did Steve Jobs say? If we're going to put a ding in the world, to quote Steve Jobs, we've got to know what kind of ding we want to make. We've got to know which bit of the world we want to make it in. And the key, I think, always is to couch benefits in such a way that they're measurable and describable, but they're not a straitjacket. Mm-hmm. And that's why it's worth taking time to understand them. And whilst there's a relationship with the scope in that, as items of the scope go, some of the benefits might be affected. Actually, I've done projects whose scope has worked out to be quite different by the end, but we still retain the same core benefits. In other words, we just found different ways of doing the same thing, in effect, or different products and to actually produce a similar benefit. Maybe we are designing a car when we should just be, opening an Uber account. Maybe we, the actual benefit we want is transportation from A to B, not actually the product, the way we solve the product. And particularly in these days as platforms as a service and software as a service and everything as a service, data as a service, which is where this digital transformation is taking us. Actually, a lot of the times, why we're building this when actually there's a perfectly good product that we can go off the shelf and use. And I think that's one of the problems, I think, with digital transformation over time is we set off with this idea and we set off building things. And then we discover halfway through that somebody's already solved this problem and there's a perfectly good app or there's a perfectly good service we can sign up to for cents on the dollar. And we're spending several $1,000s building something that we can actually get for 10 cents if we just hire it. I think, but that when you say, well, why didn't we think of that before? And you go, well, 12 months ago when we set off this journey, that thing wasn't there. That thing didn't exist. The digital landscape is moving fast enough. So I think having the North Star of benefits, but how to couch them broad enough that they don't have to need constant change, but also good enough so it's measurable to say that we've got a win, I think is important. It also concentrates the business to have an internal conversation that maybe it hasn't had. Because value, which is what we're all trying to make for people, is in the eye of the beholder. In order for us to truly understand what we're going to do, we need to know what they actually value. We need to know, and I always have this conversation saying, well, if you think it's that important, imagine it's the midnight before go live and it doesn't work. Would you still launch the rest of it? And if the answer is yes, it's not as important as you thought it was.
True that.
That's a tough conversation, Mike.
Right. As part of that build versus buy conversation, I also think people forget, what it means to own the thing after you build it, right? Because you still got to manage this project forever. It doesn't go away. It needs to be updated. It needs to be cared for. It needs to be fed. And, basically you're kind of taking on a child for the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah. And don't underestimate how long some of this stuff hangs around. I mean, I was in 2016, I had a software system that when you booted up in the morning still said copyright 1980 on it. So don't underestimate just how legacy some of this stuff can be. And by the way, that only got rid of in 2020. That's how long it stuck around for. Some 30 years past its sell-by date. But fundamentally, we now live in the world as everything is a service. Even if I rent a service now, I might migrate to a different service later. Because, that is what we do to save money. We will shift, we will change. So having that portability means having a deeper understanding of what is the benefit we're trying to get out of it. And I think that this different way of thinking, whether it's how we use AI in the future, how we lean on some of the tooling in the future, that's going to change in the body of the project. It's not something that we can set in stone at the beginning. One of the problems is, even though we're dealing with this world of constant change and digitization, we still try and build in certainty because we're still human and we like certainty and we like predictability, even though the world we're working in is inherently unpredictable. It's a VUCA world out there. It's going to change.
Are we caught up in various religious conversations about agile frameworks versus idle versus Prince 2 and all this other stuff, when reality is we're trying to balance agility versus consistency and scale and not sacrifice one for the other, but these are trade-offs. And have we kind of wrapped ourselves up in a lot of methodologies when we're really looking for an outcome and work backwards?
I think we can be. I think one of the well, I'm going to quote my grandmother now. She's no longer with us, but she said to me, David says, the thing about common sense is it's not as common as you think. And, you always learn things from your grandparents when you're small and you think, heck. Now, I was 8 when she said that. I'm now 58. I now get it, right? And you're quite right. I think that, all of these pillars need to sit on a platform of common sense. And the ultra question is going to be, does this seem reasonable to you? And sometimes we get lost in the detail. And I'm all for a few principles, and I think principles are useful to guide us rather than detailed guidance, because fundamentally, if you want to call your daily scrum a daily stand-up, I don't care. Scrum cares, I don't. A rose, what was it? Shakespeare said, a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. It doesn't make any difference. But there's this fundamental of, if we want to move out of business as usual into change the business, then that's when project management works for us. When if what we're looking for is this gradual ship of change, well, maybe we shouldn't put it in a project in the first place. Maybe we should just call this continuous improvement and literally just do it as we go. Now, both approaches work. One gets there and it takes a lot longer. But fundamentally, if you find yourself in a 7-year digital transformation project, I'm telling you, you probably shouldn't be doing this as a project in the first place, because the business just isn't going to take change that quickly. We've got to have, an aim, and we've got to have, an end date. It could be fluid, but we've got to have this idea that, we're traveling with a journey, with a destination in mind, even though we're not necessarily going to tie down the destination. I had a friend of mine once, and to get a cheap holiday, what he would do, he would pack his suitcase and he would go to the travel agent and he'd say, what do you got flying out here to somewhere hot tonight? And he'd have no idea where he was going. Anywhere in Europe, Greece, Spain, Italy, had no idea where he was going. And the travel agent would go, what? Well, hang on, what have you got flying out tonight? What packages are unsold? And he used to go on £1,000 holidays for hundreds of pounds, because they would just sell him it for next to nothing, but he would never know. And I said, did he not worry you didn't know where it was going? He said, it's a package holiday. There'll be a hotel, there'll be a bar, there'll be sun. There are certain things that are going to remain the same. I know what my benefits are that I want. I'm perfectly comfortable, therefore, working out the detail later. And sometimes he had to jump in a taxi and drive all the way to another airport on the other side of the country in order to get the package he wanted. But he said that cost several £100s. He says, but I was saving thousands of pounds on the holiday. And I have to say, he probably had better holidays than me. But it's having that confidence to understand that the goalposts are always constantly going to be shifting. And you as a project manager can be that rock in this swirling tide. You can be that person around whom the project coalesces, because you give that, you are a safe pair of hands. One of the things I always say is it doesn't matter how terrible the news, all project managers have to take it with a straight face. Yeah. The last thing you can do is panic, because everyone around you is looking to you to provide that steady the ship. You're being asked to be that steady at the helm. And as a result, we can take, project managers learn how to do this. The very best ones do it really, really well. Because fundamentally, I say to people, Okay, you're all worried that if not now, when? And if not us, who? And if you can't say who should be doing it, if you don't tell you when it should be done, then it is now and it is us because there is no other choice. And that gives a sort of sense of calm that says, what we're going to do here is going to be fantastic. It might not be quite what we thought it was going to be, but the place we're going to end up will have benefits and it'll be better than where we are now. And as long as we're taking, as long as there's milk and honey in the land of Canaan, as long as we know that the place we're going to end up with is better than where we are now, and anything's going to be better than where we are now, right? That very basic idea is at the heart of what drives project management. And we sometimes lose sight of that amongst all the charts and the Gantt charts and the and the data and all the bits and pieces. We sometimes lose sight of the fact that we are on this journey and that, it's got to be better. We might take some hits in the meantime, but the end destination has got to be worth the travel. Otherwise, why the heck are we going there? And it's easy, you're right, to get lost in, oh no, but Scrum says you do it this way, and but page 72 of the PM BOK, who am I kidding? Page 572 of the PM BOK says we do it that way, and you just go, so what? And that confidence sometimes comes with age, but actually, I don't think it's a number. I've met people in their early 20s and early 30s who have that confidence. And I've met people in their 60s who are still born warriors and no one follows. So I don't think it's an age thing, but I think that experience helps. So screwing up early in your career is really good for you in the long run. And boy, did I do that quite a lot. And I think that inner confidence, and if you can give that to the team around you, then I don't care what the technology is. I don't care what framework you're using. You're a winner.
Mm-hmm. So to that point, I think it was Monty Python who cribbed Oscar Wilde saying you should expect the unexpected as a sign of intelligence. But how much do we spend too much time worrying about all the things that might happen versus, the 10% of things that actually will happen? So, I think that's what stresses everybody out ultimately. So how do we kind of strike a balance between understanding what's probable and what's, possible but unlikely?
Yeah, good risk management, if done well, doesn't stress you out too much. Good risk management gets to that expected value really quickly, and we draw a line on the old graph and we say, look, if it's that unlikely or if it's that small, we don't deal with it. We can quite happily accept it. And the quicker you get to that conversation, the better. But of course, good risk management, forewarned is forearmed. And I did have an exec once that said, Tomlinson, why did we do all this risk management? Nothing went wrong. And you go, yeah, boss, but the reason why it didn't go wrong is because we did a bit of risk management. But it's got to be done sensibly. And, one of the things that I've been involved with, for example, I once was asked absolutely with a straight face, now it seems ridiculous, is should we really be spending all this time on pandemic planning when you know it's never going to happen? Because back in the 1990s, I was part of the team in the British Army that planned for pandemics. And funnily enough, during the real pandemic, our National Health Service turned to the military and said, we would like your help with distributing the vaccine. And 102 Log Brigade, Logistics Brigade turned up and went, yep, we can do it for you starting tomorrow. And they went, oh, how long will it take you to get ready? No, we'll start tomorrow. We have a plan. We know how this works. We've been planning for it for years because we risk manage this. And it was one of the things we know how to do. One of the 10,000 things the military knows how to do, but we actually dust off a plan and we know how to do it. And people go, wow. But then you think, well, but the military spends most of its time, I've been to war. That's actually relatively short. We spend most of our time hanging around practicing. So, the military is very good at having done risk management and understand, what to plan for. But everyone was shocked that somehow it just hit the ground running because fundamentally that's what they know how to do. So take a leaf out of their book. I was being told, expect the best, but carry a big stick. Fundamentally, a little bit of project management, but don't sweat the small stuff. Establish your risk tolerance really, really early, along with your benefits. Get to know what your risk tolerance is. and understand what types of risk your organization will tolerate easily and what ones they're going to be highly sensitive about. And then that allow you to do just enough risk management. I think what we're talking about here, Mike, is the Goldilocks principle. Fundamentally not too hard, not too soft, but just right. All of this comes back to the common sense Goldilocks principle. And risk management's great, but if you over concentrate on it, you'll just become the naysayer that nobody listens to, and you become, mixing my stories, the little boy who cries wolf all the time. And that's no good. But by the same, hang on, Mike, that's nearly 4 millennia old, that story. Should we really be sharing it as modern advice? But
it's the test of time.
Yeah, it's there for a reason. But fundamentally, I think it's about getting that concept of balance. But in order to understand that, we've got to understand the business and what it's willing to tolerate, what it will take, what it won't take. And that means having a relatively short but grown-up conversation early in the project to lay some of this out. And I'm not talking about laying down, criteria. What I'm talking about is laying down the basic ground rules. And the very best organizations know how to run projects like this. They understand that difficult conversation. A lot of organizations are relative newbies to the project management world in that they expect projects to be done to them, not with them. And they find this whole conversation a little bit strange. But I always say to them, look, you need to know how to get the best out of me. This is how to get the best out of me. And so what I've developed over the years is almost like the Tomo project management manual. Yeah, I can hand it to you and say, Mike, if you want to use me, this is how I work best. You can give me other stuff, but if you want to use me to my optimum, this is my operations manual. And it's a concept from this idea of neurodiversity, but actually we're all like that. But I think project managers have, a certain way of, we should lay out how we need to work. And one of them is you need to be honest and share your goals, your thoughts, your fears, your risks. And I want your hopes and fears, because out of that, I can craft you a successful outcome. Without knowing your hopes and fears, I could very easily give you the thing you fear and dash the hopes that you might have, and yet still think to me, oh, look, I've done it to time, cost and budget. Look at me, aren't I wonderful? But actually, I've just wrecked your business, even though I've done it. So there's a very big difference between success criteria and benefits, and people often muddle the two up. And that's true of everything, but digital transformations are so embedded in organizations and their ethos and their culture change that they're going to make, that you just have to have that conversation.
And I think it's an easy conversation to have with business executives and people think, because all of them are trained on risk. That's what they get taught at school and when they're getting their MBAs or whatever degree that they have. Every business course is about measuring and balancing risk. So if you start from that point, they can understand it. What they don't understand is a Gantt chart, because that's just noise to them.
Absolutely. Although as a graduate of the University of Life with a postgraduate certificate from the School of Hard Knocks, a lot of that has to be tempered with experience.
All right, Tomo, we got time for maybe 4 minutes. What's your best advice to folks as they kind of look at these digital transformation initiatives? It's easy to be skeptical of them, but they're a fact of life. They are career opportunities. How should project managers engage?
I think fundamentally, with a clear conscience, a keen eye, and a hopeful heart, they're the three things. You'll acquire the keen eye as you've done these things more than once. But with a clean conscience, your hands have got to be clean. You've got to say, look, this is going to be difficult. Of course it is. But of course, who'd hire people to do easy stuff? The whole point we're here is because it's difficult. So we should never complain it's difficult. Of course it is. But there are some lit up lands. We should have a joyful heart, because I have seen the difference that these projects can make into businesses and people's lives. Fundamentally here in the UK, we've got digital business, where people are doing online things that used to take 6 weeks to do on paper, and their lives were blighted and they can now just do it in a few clicks online. And fundamentally, we might go, so what? Well, what I mean, so what? I bought a car, Mike, and I said to my wife, we're going to get a car loan. And she went, oh, great. Well, I'll get all the information together, your pay slips and all of the information to go and do it. And so I went on my phone. I said, great. I says, I've got it sorted. She said, oh, you booked the appointment to go to the bank and grovel for the money. No, the money for the car loan, bing, has just gone in our bank account. And she went, but surely this was going to take weeks and lots of groveling and paperwork and getting tutted at people at the bank. And I went, welcome to the digital transformation. We're not in that world anymore. And it's not just me, because it's happening to millions of people all over the world at the same time. Fundamentally, we're making the world better. And this is where digital transformation, there are some projects you can point at and go, well, it's a slightly better mousetrap, so what? Digital transformations, you can actually make a dent in the world. You can actually transform real people's lives, and for the better. So do it with a hopeful heart.
Mm-hmm. I think at the end of the day, it's a perilous journey. There's no two ways about it. People are putting their careers at risk. They are concerned about how this is all going to turn out, and they don't know. And they're a little hesitant to say that. But if you show up as a pair of safe hands that say, hey, I will get you safely from point A to point B, then we can see what happens when we get there, and we'll be in this new undiscovered country, and we'll move on from there, because there's going to be multiple projects coming behind it. I just think we don't give our fellow project managers enough credit for being the heroes of these things when it's all over and done with. So, just on the last 2 minutes, how do we make the project manager the hero of these stories? Because too often they go away and they don't get any credit, and everybody stands up and takes the credit. But if it goes wrong, they'll blame the project manager.
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes we are the makeup artist, not the star. And our job is to make the chief executive that employed us look good. So we are the makeup artists. Okay, we can amongst ourselves have our little Grammy Awards for best makeup artist, and which, the associations out there do. And, I'd love to see a Techstrong people sponsored award. Who wouldn't? But so we can do it amongst ourselves. But fundamentally, if you're in it for yourself, I think you've chosen the wrong job. I really do. Because fundamentally, your delight, the first time you walk past a computer and somebody's using a digital product you got involved in, the first time you see somebody having achieved something they couldn't have done before, or done it better than they could have done before, you can't bottle that. Yeah, the endorphins you get from that are huge. Fundamentally, you're right. Nobody remembers Eiffel's the project manager. Henri Fayol, I think it was, but nobody remembers him because you only remember Eiffel because he's the person who funded it. And yeah, but the world around us were built by project managers, from the pyramids to the Tower of London to the latest skyscraper. Yeah, everything was built by somebody.
All right, we got to check out here. And for those of you who did not notice, that was Tomo was giving me a project, assigning to me to figure out this whole awards thing. So I caught that. All right, Tomo, this was a great conversation. I'm going to give it back to Cody to take us out. Thank you all.
Well, thanks, Mike. And thank you, everybody, for listening to hopefully the twists and turns that might have been slightly insightful along the way.
Awesome. Well, so much. It was great to meet you today. And Mike, thank you for keeping us on track over this last hour. I'd like to remind our audience that we have been recording, so you will be receiving an email with a link to access this recording on demand. So keep an eye out for that. And I do also want to point your attention to a couple of links I put in the chat. The first one is for a survey that will pop that we'd like you out following this program. If you stick around with us, you will be automatically funneled into it. But if you'd like to click that link, that'll take you there a little bit faster. I've also included a link that's also in the handouts for our next project management series program. It is called How Prince 2 Helps Drive Sustainability. So feel free to reserve your spot there if you have not done so already. But we do hope to see everyone at a future webinar. Have a great rest of your day, and you may now disconnect. Tomo and Mike, thanks again.
Cheers, everyone.